Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Capital Spotlight. Today we're here with John Ohly of TSG Advocates. You are a former Hill staffer, worked on committees for a long time on Capitol Hill, so welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. Appreciate the invite.
I want to just dive into real quick kind of your background on the Hill, so can you give us a quick resume?
Yeah, so I started on the Hill in 2007 as a staff assistant on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee under then ranking member Tom Davis. And I ended up staying on the committee. Tom retired shortly after I joined, and Mr. Issa took over as the ranking member and then later chairman. So I stayed on with him for 4 or 5 years and then moved over to the Energy and Commerce Committee, where I worked on the O&I subcommittee under first Chairman Fred Upton and then Chairman Greg Walden. So in all, about 10 years on the House side.
Nice. I mean, Energy and Commerce has just such a good reputation on the Hill of being a committee that kind of gets down to business and doesn't care too much about the partisan back and forth. And obviously all committees have that, but it seems like there's just a real focus on getting the work done and working in a bipartisan manner. Is that what you experienced there?
Certainly. And I mean, people who have worked there call it the greatest committee on the Hill for a reason.
Of course they do.
There's a lot of loyalty and just appreciation among the staff about, we're going to disagree on policy a lot of the time, and there's going to be politics involved, but it really is a special place with tremendous jurisdiction across a wide variety of issues.
I feel like the people I know who have worked on that committee too, when I meet them and they're like this heavy hitter in the industry, and oh yeah, I worked on Energy and Commerce back in the day. I feel like there are some true heavy hitters who have come out of that committee on the staffer side.
Yeah, I will say one of the things that was sort of most illustrative to me when I first moved over there is they organized a ENC staff and alumni trip to Nats Park here.
Nice.
And I'm just coming over from OGR and still getting to know a lot of folks, but there were over 150 people there from both sides of the aisle, all there with their families and friends, and it was just a really neat illustration of sort of the camaraderie that comes with working on that committee.
And I think that's special too, right, is it shows how bipartisan the committee is, that you can then form these longer lasting relationships and come back and see someone that you were fighting against in a committee hearing like 10 years ago, but still be able to be cordial and be family friends. I think that there's a lot of committees where you can't say that these days, and that's a great thing to hear. So you managed to work, 10 or 11 years on the Hill?
It was 10 plus.
10 plus without ever working in a personal office. I think that's an interesting feat right there.
Yeah, it was certainly I'll say a different trajectory than a lot of folks on the Hill. And in fact, being in oversight staff for the entire time was a different trajectory than a lot of folks. So going from a staff assistant to professional staff, but on an oversight committee, and then transitioning over to ENC and staying in an oversight role there on the O&I sub. It's not your typical playbook for a Hill staffer, both either coming in or leaving the Hill.
For sure. So first, tell us about your work on oversight. Obviously, like once you get into the bulk of it, past the staff assistant, what did your role look like? What were the type of projects you were working on?
So, oversight and government reform has tremendous jurisdiction over everything, right? It looks at, it has a very narrow authorizing jurisdiction, but in terms of its oversight responsibilities, you really have broad jurisdiction. And I got to work on a wide variety of really fascinating topics, everything starting from first hearing I got to help out with, which as a lifelong baseball fan was personally enjoyable, even though I was just very much doing research in the background, was on some of the steroids in baseball.
Oh my gosh, that's crazy.
Round 2, the Clemens version.
Okay.
So got to help out with some of that, but as I progressed on the committee, took on more and more responsibilities, helped out on the Toyota gas pedal investigation, which is sort of my first entry into the automotive space. And then, the first investigation that I really took on that was sort of my own was under Mr. Issa, was on the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and some of the concerns we were hearing from bipartisan commissioners about how that was functioning. And so that was almost, I would say, a little over a year of my time was mostly devoted to that one investigation.
Wow. So take us into that, because I don't think a lot of staffers and member offices don't get that opportunity to really just dive into one issue and become a subject matter expert there. So what did that process look like? How did you sink your teeth into it?
So in that one in particular, we had really started off looking at concerns around the Yucca Mountain project, and this has been a long-standing, government program for how we're going to manage nuclear waste, and there was some decisions made about walking back from that, and so we were starting to look into that issue, and as we got in, started digging into it and talking to folks at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and trying to understand some of the decision-making process, more and more issues started to come to light to us in terms of how the agency was functioning and some concerns about how it was being led from the top. So that ultimately ended up with, it sort of culminated with 4 of the 5 commissioners sending a letter to then President Obama raising concerns about the chairman at the time, which then led to some hearings on our end. So it was a pretty exciting, very in the weeds. I learned a lot more about the functioning of a regulatory agency than I expected to, but as someone who was and remains very interested in the potential for nuclear power, but also the effectiveness of a regulator and making sure that we have an effective regulator in that space. It was a really exciting opportunity for me.
Yeah, I feel like we're finally getting there on nuclear energy.
Well, yeah, we'll see, hopefully.
Yeah, we'll see for sure. So once the letter is written to President Obama, does the president have any recommendation power when it comes to, hey, I'd like Congress to investigate this, or do they really stay away
That
from
was
it?
actually an outgrowth of the investigation.
Okay.
So it was, in fact, in advance of the hearing that we already had scheduled. But it was the bipartisan commissioners coming together to say, like, we're not going to let this just be the congressional voice. This is our own voice on this issue.
Very cool. Is it pretty typical being a professional staff member that you have those opportunities to really dive into a specific topic for a while, or was that kind of a unique circumstance that it lasted that long?
I would say it was a bit of a unique circumstance. I mean, there's certain investigations that are going to take up more of your time, and depending on how the committee is structured at different points in time, different chairmen have different ways of operating the committee. Some of them, have more clearly dedicated subcommittee staff for each of the individual subcommittees. Others, at the time, Chairman Issa had really decided that he wanted to have sort of an oversight staff and then an investigation staff.
Okay. Gotcha.
And the oversight staff led a lot more of the sort of day-to-day subcommittee work on things like existing government programs like the loan guarantee program and some of that other work. The investigations team tended to take on sort of individual topics and work for longer periods of time. So a number of my colleagues were working on the Fast and Furious program at the time.
Heck of a time to be there.
And later some of the countrywide loan issues. And so that's what gave me I was part of the investigations team and had the flexibility to really dig into that one issue.
Was that something where you started on the committee side of things, just like working your way up as a staff assistant, and eventually you get the opportunity, if you like show promise, to be on the investigative side?
Yeah, so I started as a staff assistant, and still believe that a lot of the best Hill staffers get that opportunity to start as a staff assistant because you learn some skills that you don't otherwise in terms of dealing with folks on the phone and just sort of the soft skills that are hard to get outside of having that experience. So being at the front line there was a great opportunity, but also for my first job on the Hill, it was tremendous for me because we were in the minority at the time. My desk was situated right by the staff director, deputy staff director, chief counsel, chief investigative counsel. And so I was able to see sort of the operations of the committee from the ground level while also getting that sort of, being the front of the office experience.
Yeah, that's great. You get to be a fly on the wall and just like understand operational thought processes at a very high level. I'm sure that was extremely helpful as you grew on the committee.
Yeah, and over those first few years, I got the opportunity to, both dabble in helping with some of the investigations or oversight activities that were ongoing at the time, as well as, our floor operations. So I was exposed to that side of the house. So sort of managing suspensions and helping to write floor statements. OGR has I guess you could call it the privilege of naming a lot of post offices. And so
Oh,
we have
lucky
to
you.
manage a lot of time on the floor for suspensions.
Yeah, for sure.
And so, but that was good for me because it gave me exposure to a different side of things. I ultimately then continued to focus more and more on the oversight and investigation side. But I really cherished those opportunities because it's a chance to be sort of down on the floor with members in a way that you aren't on a typical day from an
For
oversight
sure.
side.
Yeah, that's really cool. How did you make the switch over to ENC first?
So I had gotten to know a lot of the folks at ENC during the Toyota gas pedal investigation, and then had been talking to them for a number of years. And once there was an opportunity to make the switch over there, the timing was right for me. They finally had the budget to add some folks, and it was the right time in my career for a shift.
So, how does that role apply to then going to ENC? Was it just a similar role, just on a different committee, or was it different jurisdiction?
Obviously, oversight can play in ENC's jurisdiction, but ENC is going to protect its jurisdiction, and it has its own oversight and investigation subcommittee.
Okay.
So I joined that team and had the opportunity. I was going over there with the intention of really focusing on some work they were going to be doing on DOE labs and modernizing the Department of Energy. But about I would say a week or 2 weeks after I started, I think it was about a week after I started, the GM ignition switch news broke. And since I had gotten to know them from the Toyota gas pedal investigation, that was my first project on the committee. So I think it was 2.5 weeks after I started, we were already receiving, thousands of pages of documents from General Motors, and I was asking people that I had never met before to stay over the weekend to prepare for a hearing with the GM CEO, 3 weeks after I'd started.
So can you give a little context for some of the younger folks of the ignition switch process or scandal?
So there was a defect that was identified in GM vehicles that had led to some fatalities with airbags not deploying due to an issue with the ignition switch. There was a lot of news around this, and the chairman at the time, Fred Upton, was not going to let this go unexamined.
Yeah.
And so very quickly was onto the phone with General Motors and working with us to get them in before the committee, and so that led to some hearings, and then I spent really I would say the first 8 months really digging in on that issue, which ultimately led to a committee report that focused a little bit more on the agency side of things and ways that NHTSA could be more effective. NHTSA, the federal regulator for the automotive industry.
And is that how you just really solidified yourself as being in the automotive space?
I wouldn't have said that I saw myself as an auto guy at that point, because I was still working on a lot of different issues at ENC. I got to work on everything from a lot of different areas in cybersecurity and grid and DOE programs and non-proliferation issues. So some really interesting areas that brought me a lot of joy and substance, and that's part of the wonder of working on the Hill. You get to work on a lot of different things.
For sure.
I also later did the VW Dieselgate investigation, which sort of maybe further cemented me into the auto space. But I will say, when I was looking, when I got to that point where I was ultimately looking at a transition, I wouldn't have said autos were the first thing I was looking at, but certainly got there.
Yeah, for sure. Before we get to your transition off the Hill, tell us a little bit about your reasoning for getting into public service and your background that led you there.
Yeah, so one of those, there are a lot of them, but you don't run into them that often, folks that work in this space that grew up here in the DMV. So I grew up in Northern Virginia. And actually, my dad grew up in the same town that I grew up in. His dad was in public service. So my grandfather, he passed away when I was very young, so I didn't really get to know him. But when I was studying in college, I was a diplomatic history major, but ended up doing a senior thesis or honors paper on using my grandfather's career as sort of a guide for it. I didn't make it about him, but used his materials as a guide for that.
Tell us a little bit more about his background.
So he was a Harvard-educated lawyer who in 1940 came down to D.C. to join the War Department, and ended up he had a variety of roles there during the war, but really helped oversee a lot of the labor negotiations as part of the domestic industrial complex at the time. And then when they created the Defense Department in 1947, he joined the first Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal, as one of his 3 special assistants, and was responsible for helping set up, which at the time was sort of a new concept, the national security apparatus.
Yeah.
So he was an early executive secretary of the NSC and a few other functions before he then transitioned into the Mutual Defense Assistance Program, which was sort of under the Marshall Plan through the State Department, helping Europe's economic revitalization by building weapons and other defense systems in Europe. So he was the acting director of that at one point, but sort of in that early 1950s, early Cold War era, he was working very closely with folks like Dean Acheson and John Foster Dulles and all these others who were really shaping the trajectory of U.S. foreign policy for years to come with NATO and
I mean, we're still seeing it today, right?
Yep.
Like the Dulles brothers especially have such a hand in that process.
Yep.
Very interesting. It's very interesting too because the last person we had on the podcast, her name was Ashley Davis. She was employee number 1 at what then became DHS of the Office of Homeland Security in the White House post 9/11. So it's very funny that we're getting a lot of these kind of first people here.
Yep.
But okay, cool. So how did that inform you? Like, what was that spark that led you to want to go into public service?
Yeah, so after spending some time really studying his career, and this was, someone who could have done anything that he wanted, but he had this very, strong pull and feel the need to serve, whether it was in the military or, through public service in the government. And he went the angle of working through the government. I had another grandfather who was, had the military background on my mom's side, but he really was the guy behind the guys, if you will. He was always he never wanted to be the one in front of the camera, but he had an opportunity and took it very seriously and felt very passionate about his opportunity to help shape some of the most consequential policies in a generation. And so having people who have that passion, who have that drive to really serve the public interest and for the betterment of the country was sort of an ethos I tried to respect and adopt, especially as, you see a little bit of an erosion of what it means to be a public servant, which is a decades-long thing. That's nothing new, but just how people perceive public servants and the role of working in government. His sort of very committed and noble view of that was something that I respected and wanted to give it a shot. So I knew I wanted to do it. I took a pause my first year out of school. After I graduated college, I did 1 year working in the private sector up in Philly and decided, no, this is what I want to do.
So you went to Penn for school, stayed in Philly afterwards.
Yep.
Cool. Nice. All right, so let's talk about transition to the private sector. I think this is something we get a lot of staffers thinking about of how do I make that jump from the Hill to that next step, and I don't think the Hill provides a lot of resources on how to do that. And one of the most obvious jumps is going to be a lobbyist, right? I think it's the one that you interact with the most, and so you think you understand their job a little bit. But I guess first question off of that, like, what was the difference between going from being a staffer to being a lobbyist and working on the other side for a trade association? What did you expect a lobbyist to be, and what was it actually?
Well, maybe it's a little easy. Maybe I can sort of flip that around and just walk through sort of how I got to the trade association
Yeah.
and sort of my process of transitioning off the Hill, because I think it is instructive to some of that. You know, for me, I was a 10-year O&I staffer, and I was also not a lawyer.
Yeah.
So, you know, a typical path for a lot of O&I staffers, a lot of them are lawyers, is,
Yeah, for sure.
you know, looking at going to one of the congressional investigations practices at the large firms, which is a totally logical step. A lot of other O&I staff sometimes transition to like think tanks or groups like Heritage or others. I didn't really see myself going either of those directions, but as an O&I staffer, you have a little bit different network
for sure.
than you do as a, you know, traditional policy staffer or a personal office staffer. You know, you don't often have people who want to come talk to you, or
sure.
that are, you know, really coming to you for your policy expertise or otherwise, or trying to you know, get something. It's more of a reluctant engagement.
For sure.
Now, we did spend a lot of time when I was at Energy and Commerce building out relationships and building out engagement with folks through more positive light, trying to help leverage the convening power of O&I more so than the investigative power of
you're
O&I.
in trouble.
Right.
You're in the principal's office.
We're not always calling you to come have you raise your right hand or to write a report that's going to make you look bad.
Yeah, for sure.
So, you know, I tried to really focus on being someone who was trusted and respected, you know, by the people that I dealt with through that lens. But it was a very different, when you're looking at coming off the Hill, you know, if you're looking at an in-house job, they're looking for folks with, you know, specific policy experience.
For sure.
So for me, it was a lot of thinking through where I wanted to land, doing a lot of coffees, doing a lot of conversations.
For sure.
I didn't really know what direction I wanted to go in terms of substance or in-house, trade association, multi-client. There's lots of different directions, pros and cons for all of them. But I did know, you know, it was time to make a transition. We just had our second child. Like there's usually a trigger, and it usually involves one or two children.
For sure.
But for me, I had done 10 years, and, you know, with the arrival of our daughter Charlotte, it was time to look at a new opportunity. And honestly, was looking at a lot of different avenues in that sort of. Look, I was doing a lot of work on the grid at the time, so, you know, the utility sector. But I had been at the DC Auto Show, and it really sort of dawned on me that all of these policy issues that I was interested in, whether it was energy policy or cybersecurity, data, privacy, all converging in one sector. And the opportunity to join the trade association came along, and it turned out to be the perfect opportunity for me at the time.
Very cool. Are you a car guy, or is it really this culmination of all these different interests coming together in a car?
I do love cars. I will not pretend to be Mr. Fix-It. Okay, but I did happen to, not too long ago, was going back through my senior yearbook for whatever reason, and my in 20 years was still working on his car.
There you go.
So that was a sort of a nice little full circle for me.
Yeah. Do you have a dream car?
I'm, you know, because there's always so much changing in the automotive space. I love to experience the new tech. So I'm always a little bit of a grass is always greener. Okay. I like to try new things as they come out. So it's hard for me to say I have one dream car, because there's lots of different types of cars I like.
Fair enough. I feel like as far as tech goes, like the Escalade IQ these days, or EQ, I forget what it's called, but the big guy.
That is a big, heavy car.
Yeah, for real. Oh my gosh, the batteries, I'm sure it's just a monster. But that's like, holy crap, so many screens everywhere, but it looks beautiful. So that's in the electric world on top of my radar for sure. But nice. Okay, so tell me a little bit more about, you didn't get necessarily, while you're at a single group, a trade association lobbying on behalf of that industry, there's still a lot of work behind the scenes where it's not just, hey, this is our policy stance, this is what we're going with. how do you bring a bunch of competitors together to agree on a policy stance and move forward with that and go and lobby on their behalf?
Yeah, and that's the secret sauce of trade association life, and for the folks who excel at it and do it for a long time, it takes a lot of patience and a lot of diplomacy. I mean, because you are. I always use the phrase. We all know the cliche of working on the hills herding cats, and going into a trade association to me was herding tigers, because these are multi-billion-dollar global competitors. Who aren't always going to agree on policy, but you have to be able to speak with one voice as an industry. So when I joined as at the Auto Alliance at the time, we just had 12 OEMs. We had 12 OEMs, but that was representing the D3, the European branded companies, and then Toyota from the Asian market. Gotcha. But not long after I joined, we combined with another trade association and launched in 2020 the Alliance for Automotive Innovation, which brought in the rest of the Asian automakers, as well as a large group of suppliers, and we continued to build out the supplier network. And I was a huge supporter of the combination at the time. It was always a little frustrating as a Hill staffer having two separate automotive manufacturing.
For sure. Who do I go to on this issue?
Yeah, who's actually speaking with the full voice of the industry on this. And so having everybody under one roof, but also with the evolution of technology in the automotive space and how technology is evolving, and the growth of battery manufacturers and technology providers and semiconductors and all of these different technologies that are now integral to the automotive supply chain, having everybody under one roof makes a lot of sense, and being able to speak with to reflect the modern automotive ecosystem. Now, that comes with challenges, because you're now I was at a trade association that was OEM only, and you're bringing all of those companies together with more companies, but in addition to more OEMs, you're bringing in the supply base, which is not always what they're used to having that conversation.
Yeah, for sure.
We launched to add complexity to this already complicated equation. We launched in January of 2020 at CES. And then we're together as a newly combined staff in person for about 2 months and 13 days.
Jeez.
Before March 13th, 2020, which was the day that we took our first 2 weeks off, which became, a much longer and extended time off, as we're trying to stand up this new trade association, as we're trying to introduce it to the DC policy landscape. And then we, unfortunately, as the horrible public health crisis is taking shape, we're shutting down the auto industry for the first time since World War II. We had never ceased production in the U.S. since World War II at that time.
What a fun time to be working on those issues.
Yeah. And you have these companies who are then pivoting their supply chains, and GM is making ventilators, and it was really amazing to see and witness. But you're doing it from your basement, while I at the time had a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, and my saint of a wife was managing them.
It was very quiet in your office.
Yeah, it was very quiet, but it was also. It was a lot of stress on the family and her. I mean, she deserves a ton of credit for everything that she took on, as I was sitting there learning what staring at these tiny squares on my screen were for, 8 hours a day.
For sure. Wow, that's just a fascinating time. And it's got to be so interesting to be a part of that industry at a time like that, and especially as your grandfather comes into politics in the face of World War II and just being a part of that moment. I'm sure it was almost more engaging because you got to go to the office and be a part of that, and doing it from home had to be very odd, but still a very special moment.
Yeah.
I'm sure you're glad it's over.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot gained in those early years at the association. There was also, it was a lot of tough times for a lot of folks, but, in the picture of what was happening globally, always have to keep that in mind as well. But it was, I loved my time working with the industry. I mean, it is one of the most iconic industries here in the U.S. Sure. It is integral to our economic and national security, and will continue to be. And this is just such a notwithstanding, 2020 and 2021, I mean, just this moment in the evolution of automotive technology globally is just such an incredibly pivotal time that it was a real privilege to have the opportunity to spend 8 years representing that industry.
Yeah, that's really cool. All right, so now that you're out of that industry, what's your favorite car brand?
Well, I'm not fully out of that industry because
Okay,
I'm
all right.
still working a little bit in that
Fair
space.
enough.
So I can't pick loyalties other than existing clients. So
Fair enough. Yeah, that was a bad question. Okay, so talk to us now about going over to like full multi-client work. Why did you decide it was time to go over and do that type of thing? And then what does your work look like now?
yeah, so I spent 8 years at the trade association, and as I said, loved it and still love the industry and the folks that I worked with. It just for me and looking at where I wanted to grow, it was time for a new challenge. The typical. A lot of times when people think about transitioning off a trade association, you think about going in-house to one of the member companies, and that's a very frequent transition. There were fewer opportunities for that right now, given where the auto industry is and some of the capital constraints they face at the moment and how they're handling their own GR teams. But I wanted to stay connected with the industry, but I also wanted an opportunity for me to continue to grow personally, and I wanted to help. One of the things I really enjoyed at the trade association was help build something, right? Yeah. We were creating something new, and I wanted to have an opportunity to continue to do that. So spent a lot of time looking at sort of what direction I could go with that, having had 8 years of trade association experience, and multi-client really did feel like the next step for me. But it was finding the right fit and the right model. There's a lot of different models in multi-client and a lot of different structures. So for me, it was finding the right fit, both in terms of model and people.
So obviously Hill staffers see you on the Hill. They know that part of the job. What does it look like behind the scenes?
So, TSG Advocates were relatively new here in Washington. The shop opened January of 2025. Cool. So I joined just a few months ago, so I'm relatively new to the team, but it's been a very fast-growing firm. So Great. They went from 0 clients in the beginning of end of 24, beginning of 25, and now well over 100. So it's been fun to be on the inside of that for a few months now and sort of see where this firm is growing. We're moving into new office space just next week. Cool. So, but we have a beautiful townhouse on the Hill, and it's one of the things that really sort of stood out to me when I was looking at a transition and finding this new firm is like they're investing in this the right way. They're trying to build something unique and something special, and they're investing in it in the right way. And that started with this, beautiful townhouse. It's right behind the Supreme Court. It's an opportunity and that'll be sort of our we call it the embassy, our launch pad for Hill Days and events and otherwise. And then we'll be moving into sort of nice, beautiful downtown office space to have which I'll enjoy having a full-time desk. I won't lie about that.
I mean, Capitol Hill houses are beautiful, especially when they're right by the Supreme Court, but it's not an office environment, right?
My typical desk is our kitchen counter or dining room table, and
there you go.
Some days that's good, some days it's not the best.
Not too many amenities,
Yeah.
All right, well, that's great. Before we go, tell us about who you are outside of work. What do you like to do? What's family life look like?
I mean, family is a lot of what I do.
For sure.
I've got a 10-year-old and 8-year-old, so both busy with lots of activities. So my weekends are almost as busy as my weekdays.
For sure.
Running around to different activities, but it's honestly some of the most fun that I could ever imagine having. We love to travel and try to take expose the kids to that and get them out and about. My wife, who is a saint, took the kids to London for 5 days over their spring break. I had just started the new job, so I wasn't able to go, but they had a wonderful time. They're at such a fun age where they're just excited to explore and learn and see new things. So really love doing that. My wife would hate for me saying this, but my son got into trading cards, and that sort of rekindled my my interest in it. So he and I do
really
that together.
Scratches that like little kid itch inside
Yep.
of you for sure.
And it's a whole new beast than it was when I was, growing up in the
Yeah.
wax pack era. But it's a lot of fun and something he and I get to do together. So I've been
great.
really enjoying that and just watching them grow, try new things. My daughter's really into riding, so when I get to take her out to do that, it's fun to see her just light up when she gets on a horse.
sure.
And and then if I get some time to myself, I enjoy playing around a golf or getting out into the woods.
All right. Love to see it. Well, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yep,
It's great
it's my
to talk to
pleasure.
you.
Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you for tuning into Capital Spotlight Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe to our channels to stay updated on new releases, share the show with your friends, and rate the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. For more from Connect, subscribe to our daily newsletters, follow us on social media, and check out our website, all at Capital Connect, capital with an O, CNCT. See you next time.